think you're good.
Excellent. Well, everybody, welcome to our saltlake.net user group meeting tonight. It's cold and rainy day here in Salt Lake City, Utah. We know that we get people who join from many places, and hopefully you've had weather that you like. This weather is perfect for me. Some people like it sunny, some people like it rainy, but this has been a great day for me. As we get started today, I want to remind everybody, please stay on mute until you are prepared to speak. That will greatly reduce the echo and feedback in a large online meeting. If you feel uncomfortable jumping in with a comment, there's a chat option on Zoom, and I believe there's chat options in YouTube as well. We will try to monitor those chats. So if you have something to add or a question, you can type it into the chat. One of the hosts will try to bring it up at an appropriate time. We appreciate those of you who have your camera on, as being able to see each other enhances our interaction. At the same time, please be aware of whether or not your camera is on and what might be visible to others. I know that as my camera is on, when my camera is on, I have a little dog who walks behind me all the time. So he doesn't usually add anything, but he likes to attend meetings with me. Just to review our agenda today, we're going to have an opportunity for a few lightning talks. So here in just a second, I'm going to ask if anybody would like to give a lightning talk. Following our lightning talks, we'll have our main presentation, Achieving Amazing Web Performance, by Microsoft MVP Robert Boedigheimer. I think I said your name right.
You did.
At least
Good
reasonably
job.
close. And then following the presentation, we'll be having our book club, where we'll finish talking about part 1 of the Phoenix project. In between the performance and the book club, we will talk a little bit about feedback, get feedback for our presenter. We also have a few prizes to give away. So your entry for prizes is based on your providing feedback for our speaker tonight. So hopefully you'll do that before you log out. So a couple of housekeeping bits. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Every subscription to the YouTube channel, bumps us up in the algorithm and makes it easier for people to find us. You can also find our YouTube channel by searching for Salt Lake City or slc.net user group. And as I said before, you can ask questions using the chat feature on Zoom or YouTube. Lightning talks. Guidelines are simple. You have up to 5 minutes to talk about anything tech or tech adjacent, really anything that you think might be interesting to our group. So if you want to give a lightning talk and want to volunteer, just say so in the chat. You can also use the reactions in Zoom and raise your hand. Really, it's anything you'd like to talk about. I'm looking down so I can get my timer ready. Let's see, I don't see any reactions. Do I see anything anybody in the chat? Anybody interested in doing a lightning talk on any topic? Sorry, did I make the slides go away?
Still there.
Okay.
So if you want a time filler, I'll talk about Pi-hole.
Okay. I think what we'll do then is we'll have Robert talk about Pi-hole. And then if nobody else, I've got the beginnings of a larger talk so kind of a theme. I just want to I'll talk a little bit about the theme of a larger talk that I'm working on. called Blind Advice.
And if anybody's interested, I have some thoughts on artificial intelligence.
Oh, in that case, then Anthony, you
So
can
I'll
take-
back out.
Oh.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure you had a spot filled. So why don't
Well,
the two of you do that, and then
that'll work.
all right.
Let's have Anthony on artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Now, Anthony, are you ready to talk right now, or do you want to have me talk for a minute before you talk?
You can go ahead and talk and let me know when you're ready.
Okay, so I'm gonna put my phone here and set a timer. I don't think I'm gonna take the 5 minutes, but I do want to be sensitive of everybody's time. So ready, go. So I've been over the last couple of years cooking a lot more than I used to. And in addition to my own cooking, I now have 4 adult children, and they have all gotten married and have all moved out of my house. Yay. That is a great great spot to reach in your life. But as they've each moved out, they've asked for recipes that we've made and basically my hints for cooking. What do you do for easy meals? What do you do to prep meals to come out all at the same time? And so that idea has been rolling around in my head when I saw an interview of a master chef, and I wish I could remember who the master chef was, but the person who was interviewing them asked them, what advice would you give to an aspiring chef who you've never met, you don't know anything about them, and you don't know what dishes they're making or what they're doing? And his advice was, he said, if I don't know anything about them, my advice is you don't have enough garlic and you have too much rice. He said, irrespective of almost anything, those are 2 mistakes that early chefs always make: not enough garlic, enough rice. And that piqued my interest because my advice to my kids has always been, if you are cooking something sweet, add more vanilla than the recipe says. And if you're cooking something savory, add more garlic than the recipe says. So I thought, well, that at least part of that idea is validated by a master chef. But I've realized that in software, there are also principles of blind advice. If I don't know anything about you or your project or anything about the environment you work in, is there advice that I could give that would most likely apply to any situation? And I'm working on multiple ideas, but my number one idea of blind advice is take smaller steps. Almost every developer I've met starts out, and often well into their career being a senior, takes bigger steps than they need to. And there are huge advantages to taking smaller steps. Smaller steps are easier to test. They're easier to revert if you've made a mistake. They're easier to track in source control and to see the flow. They're easier to replicate. So my blind advice to anyone is take smaller steps. And that is my 5-minute lightning talk. And I do have a minute left, but I'm going to forego that unless somebody has a burning question or a burning comment about that. And if not, we're going to get the timer ready. And Anthony, whenever you're ready to share with us your thoughts about AI, I will start the timer, and then I'll give you over here to the camera. I'll give you a 1-minute sign when you have 1 minute left to go. Okay.
Thank you, Gary. Those were really good insights. I think the information of taking little steps first is always a good way to progress. it keeps you feeling confident. Taking too big of steps reduces the confidences. Well, anyway, yes, I wanted to kind of discuss some of my insights of artificial intelligence, or AI. Talking to a lot of people and having them discuss what it is, or even be afraid what it is, compared to what I understand it to be, is kind of unnerving. What I understand artificial intelligence is really a way to manipulate data or analyze data real time and project a regression for a future event that most possibly occurred based on the input data and the algorithm used to project the next step for it to use. It's not really intelligent. Matter of fact, it's stupid. And it also depends on the input data that it receives. But today, because of the incredible technology that we have and the information gathering that is possible, people could connect to this information depending on how they get this information and begin to analyze trends real time. Most of this information comes from social media. Most of this information is coming from outlets or email, or even inside of the intelligence agencies, that they get this data, and then they start modeling projections using statistics, and usually linear regression or much more fancier regression techniques to project the next step. It is compelling because of projecting results for financial gain. You could see previous results and get an idea of where the market's going through trends. But my disconcern is not really intelligence. It's only based on the information received. And just to get an idea, has anybody had that same conclusion, or am I just seeing something unusual?
No, I think that that's a I think that's something that I'm certainly noticing. In fact, I recently read Weapons of Math Destruction and a couple of other books on the way algorithms have infiltrated our lives, and realized that one of the examples they use in one of these books is embedded in a project that I have to maintain. So yeah, it makes me very nervous.
Yes, it is very disconcerting, as I said. And also the input data could be misleading. If you somehow corrupt the input data, you will have some bad decisions. Of course, artificial intelligence in predicting things in a short time, like driving a car and stuff, those things are more reliable. But when you're starting to think that it is as creative as human intelligence, it's not even close. It is so fallible that I wouldn't even consider it a friend in making a decision to tell me to go to dinner or not. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's about my 5-minute talk talking about artificial intelligence. Maybe one of these days we could discuss the statistics and regression theory and data gathering and possibilities of where to get that data and how it could be done, and the projections from it, and the possible dystopia that we may become with it. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anthony. Appreciate that. And that's a great lead into, at the end of our slides, we'll post up a link. If you know somebody, or if you are an expert in that topic, or really if you feel like you'd like to present on any topic, we're taking we're taking submissions for proposals for speakers for the next year. So we'll share that at the end of the night. With that, we're going to move on to our main speaker. Robert Boedigheimer works for Schwann's Home Delivery, providing business solutions with web technologies. He's a Microsoft MVP and a process ninja with Fiddler, an ASP insider, and a Pluralsight author. He's also a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo. I know when I shared this with a coworker, sorry, the dog got excited. When I shared that with a coworker, that was the first thing he picked out of the bio was third degree black belt in Taekwondo. Robert regularly speaks at national and international events, and we turn the time over to him for his presentation.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So we're going to talk about achieving amazing web performance. And I won't spend much time on this slide because we kind of went through that, but I do have my Twitter, my email, and my blog information. And I do have the slides and the code are available. And there's two different pieces of code. There's the performance before and performance after. So I basically created a web page before I did any of the techniques. And then I did the same thing with quite a few of the techniques, not all of them. And I'm giving you both those two versions so you can compare with and without the improvements. So we'll jump in. So I worked on compilers for a while. I'm an ASP.NET C# developer. So when I walked into web performance, my day job, I work on an e-commerce site, and performance is obviously one of our concerns. When I started really focusing on performance, I was assuming it was going to be server-side code, C# optimization, things like that. Right around then, Steve Soder's had his really great book on web performance. And his research actually showed for most websites, 80 or 90% of the time is actually spent waiting for page resources. So all the images, the JavaScript, the CSS, it's not likely that you have backend code problem. I will show you how you can determine that through some of the tools we're going to use, but we're going to focus on more from the HTML and the resource perspective, not so much the accessing backend systems to gather the data and such. The general rules around performance, you want to make fewer HTTP requests. So the less requests you're making, the better. I put it in italics because we're going to talk about HTTP 2 and how some of these rules have shifted slightly. But obviously you don't want to make requests that you don't need. You want to send as little as possible, and you want to send it as infrequently as possible. So once we start going through actual techniques, we'll see how those apply back to one or more of these rules. Throughout the talk, I'm going to use Fiddler. Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. So Eric Lawrence was working at Microsoft on the online clip art tool. People would order clip art years ago, and they would have an issue, and they would call in and say, I can't download this clip art. And there weren't really good diagnostic tools for people to use. And so Eric, he didn't know C#, didn't know .NET, really didn't know HTTP, said, he went and learned all that stuff and wrote Fiddler, which I find kind of amazing. So this is one of the primary tools I'm going to use throughout the demos to show how you can see performance. I just wanted to give you a link to where this is. They do have a new version. So I know a lot of people have probably used Fiddler on Windows before. Fiddler Everywhere is now runs on a Mac and a Linux as well. So if you're interested in that, and they've redone the interface and done some more collaboration and stuff. I'm going to focus on Fiddler Classic tonight because there's a few of the techniques I use that come from that. So let me show you, I'll jump over and show you kind of a before and after of what we're going to look at. So I'm going to start up Fiddler. And as I said, I've got a sample travel page. So I'm just going to hit Control F5 here to make sure that it's not cached. We'll jump over to Fiddler. And I'm going to do that again. For some reason, that didn't pick that up. Because I want to show you. I'm going to try another one. I don't know what it's doing. I hope I didn't change one of my configs here that I'll need. We'll see. That's not great when it starts that way. We'll hit this one again. Let me check one of my settings. If you didn't know this, you can start, okay, I wanted to make sure I didn't have this on. You can turn on to force Edge to run only using HTTPS. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't doing that. So let me do that again. All right. Let's hope it all comes together this time. You are not cooperating here. Give me a second. Of course, it all works before you start.
I was gonna say, very normal. No worries.
Almost looks like my web server is not alive. All right. What are you doing to me here? I definitely have traffic. I want to make sure I can get anywhere here. I seem to be really stuck. Let me try restarting these one more time. Apologize for that. There we go. All right, I don't know what that was all about. And it is just not tracing for me here. All right, I'm going to skip that part for now. So I'll talk through this. Basically, at the before and after, I'm not a designer. So I did Bootstrap and I just made a fictional travel page. And when I come in here, I've got the before and after version. And the important part is I just wanted to show you that the before and after of this visually look the same. I'm going to jump over into web page test here and show you. Let me see if I can get up to my other one. If I could get my Fiddler to work, what it would show you is that it's tracing one more thing here. Hold on. I might have left something in here I shouldn't have left in here. That is the problem. I apologize for that. That's what happens when you test on your demo machine. All right, I think we're going to have it now. Awesome. All right, so the before version, what I'll do is I'll come into Fiddler and I like to look at statistics and I'll see that that page is about 3 meg and it was 12 requests. Typical today is probably about 75 requests and about 2 to 3 meg for a web page. So I just want to show you that the after version of this, if I hit Control F5 for that, we come back in here. If I look at the statistics again, you'll see I still had 12 requests, but it's only 128K. So if you look above, the entire page weight now with all the optimizations we're going to do is about 128K. We had images before that were 330K, so almost twice the size. So we have made a massive improvement in how much needs to be downloaded. And we'll see how that's going to play through with all the time. So what was going on with me? I'll just mention Fiddler I use to intentionally slow things when I do performance testing. So what you saw was I was actually testing my own e-commerce site, I made all of the third-party controls on the page super slow because I wanted to be able to see if any third party was slow, would that impact my site? So unfortunately, it was making all my stuff slow. Talk about metrics. So it's important when you're looking at performance, you want to know what are you tracking? There are literally tens, 50, 100 different metrics that you could look at. I'm going to focus on these. So I talked before about if I truly had a server-side issue, this first byte would be long. So what first byte means is the browser sent a request to my server and my server gave the first byte of the response. So when I look through the tools, if you really did have backend problems like slow access to SQL Server or something like that, your first byte would be really long. As we said, most websites, your first byte will be okay, and it's all of the other stuff. So I just want to mention that you should check that if things are really slow in case you have a backend issue. I like to use speed index. So speed index is a measure of basically the above the fold or what's visible on the screen is mostly done. And so we'll see how that metric plays out. Again, there's a lot of other ones from history. When the page on load event fires, when it's fully loaded, meaning everything is absolutely downloaded. Lately, Google has come out with Chrome Web Vitals. So they said, we really want to get some metrics that better visualize 3 different aspects of a customer's experience with your website. The first one is the largest contentful paint. So whatever's the biggest, typically hero image or something on a page, how long does it take for that to be visible? What is the first input delay? Meaning I might see the page right away, but I'm not able to interact with it. So first input delay says how soon after the page is visible can someone start to actually use it? And then the last one is cumulative layout shift. I'm sure this has never happened to you, but if you've been to a web page and things are moving around, like you click where something is and suddenly the page shifts and how annoying that is, that's measured by cumulative layout shift. So I've shifted recently to start using Core Web Vitals. It's part of Chrome's ranking algorithm now. So it's a good measure of 3 different things I can focus on. And I know it has impact on our search engine rankings and such. So that's what I'm focusing on now. Next thing is you need to know how to measure. So I'm going to show you, I showed you Fiddler already. We'll keep coming back to that. I also use webpagetest.org if you're familiar with that. They have free computers and agents all around the world where you can go kick off a specific test. So I'll show you what that would look like. So if you go to web page test, you can choose where you want to run from. So I can choose any of these locations. I can choose various browsers at various locations. I can just punch in a URL and run a test. And I didn't want to make you wait for me to run that, so I ran web page test against my before version of the site and my after. And I just want to show you what you can learn from this. So the good thing, they do some basic scoring up here based on techniques that we're going to talk about. We'll ignore the security storing because I need to do some work on my host here. But you can see that the before version, it's not horrible, but it definitely calls out that I need to do some compressing and some caching, which we'll talk about. Here are the main metrics. So it ran the page 3 times, and these are the measurements that it saw. So you can see that on average, they took the median run here, which was the second one. Speed index was about 1.7. So again, that's when most of the top part of the screen seems to be roughly there. Largest contentful paint in my case will probably be this image. We'll see how we can see that. The cumulative layout shift is pretty bad. So they're grading me here at the same time. They're saying me compared to most other sites. I'm not doing that great for largest contentful paint, but I definitely have a lot of layout shift and my blocking time's not too bad. So again, those are the high level metrics. These are the core web vitals that we talked about. And then what I like to do is look at the waterfall diagram. So if you've seen waterfall diagrams before, it's pretty typical. Here's the request for the actual HTML page. And then I can see that it's downloading a JavaScript file. I can see that it's got Bootstrap's JavaScript file, some CSS. So I can quickly look at this and it's telling me some events up top here. So I can see the first contentful paint is at about 1.5 seconds. We saw the largest contentful paint is out here around 2.7 or so. And we can see all of these other events. So I can look at this quickly and start seeing what's taking some time. And it indicates for me that these 2 JavaScript files are actually blocking the rendering of my page, which will be important when we talk about techniques later. The other thing that'll stand out is we've got these images and it takes quite a while to have those downloaded. So just by looking at this, I've got some things that I can focus on. I can also look at connections below, and we'll talk about, I'm using HTTP 1.1 for this. So it opens up 6 different connections to that host. And each one of them needs to start up and do slow start and all that other kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that when we look at HTTP 2. The cool thing I like about this is that you can capture videos. And I find it useful when I talk to my marketing group and I say, we shouldn't do this technique because it makes it slow. I can do a before and after for them. And I find that people respond a lot better to the visual. So I can show them that took about 3 seconds or so. If I were to go now and look at the after version, see, I didn't do anything about my host, but all my scores on everything else are better. I can see my metrics now. I'm green all the way across the board on core vitals, so I have no shifting going on. I don't have any JavaScript blocking time. And I'm down from 2.7 or 8 seconds to just about a second. So I've made big improvements on the time. If I again look at the waterfall, I can see that I've got my main connection. I can still see I've got some CSS. You can notice now I don't have any JavaScript that's blocking my rendering, but I do have to wait for CSS in this case before the page will render. But you notice those images that were taking a long time before are greatly sped up. So that's one of the main places where we save some space and time. And then we can see the JavaScript file. You'll also notice that they're all happening in parallel. And that's because I'm using HTTP 2, which we'll talk about. So I'm down to a single connection. So again, I can come back in here and show a video and just show people that that's the experience difference. You can see things didn't shift. It didn't look like it was slowly doing things. It just came in and painted. So I actually save off these URLs for history. So I'll keep before I do an improvement and after, and I'll do these measurements. But then I can keep it for history as well when I need to go back and show people why we did what we did. Some other measurement that we do, we use synthetic monitoring, it's called. So we pay a service that watches our several pages on our website from various cities in the US. I like using synthetic for part of my measurements because I know it's the same computers, all the time. So every time I do a performance improvement, I know it's the same 10 computers sitting on the same networks. So I can measure and have a very clean apple to apple. These 10 computers got faster by this percentage by whatever I decided to change. That doesn't give me a full picture though. Those are typically well-connected computers. So we've started to use real user monitoring. So real user monitoring is instrumentation that you can put into your site that is recording from the client side of all of your customers. So now every user who comes to the site, we can actually capture how long their page took to download and then also every resource on the page. So if I want to find out if someone had a poor experience with my site, I could go in and see their waterfall diagrams and I could identify specifically what was slow for them. So those are some of the measurements. Again, it's important to understand what metric am I watching and how am I going to measure it so that as I make improvements, I can see that I'm going forward as I'm doing things and improving my process. How do I know when it's good enough? So it was interesting, Amazon and Walmart, this is one of those famous examples for performance. They did an A/B test. So they intentionally slowed half their customers basically by 100 milliseconds. So just 1/10 of a second. And when they measured them against the ones that they didn't slow down, they lost 1% of sales. So if you think of that for both, it's interesting, they both had the same number. A 1/10 second slower meant they collectively lost 1% of their sales. That's how much performance means to them. I think it's important for you to know that. I would love if my company let me do that because we have a lot of performance discussions and people want to add a new font or something to our website. And I say, well, that's going to slow it down. It would be nice if I knew the math of exactly how many sales do we lose? What percent do we lose by being slower? Because then every time I come forward with a performance improvement idea, we can just do math. If I can say I can speed you up by half a second, and I know that will give us 3% of sales, I can prioritize my performance projects just like they would prioritize business features, if that makes sense. So I think that that's interesting to know. It's good to know how you compare with your competitors. So Speed Curve is a rum vendor, and they have a web page out where you can go look and see how you compare to others. So I'm in retail, so I'll come out and look at retail on a slow device, and I want to see the speed index. So I can just see if I know what my measurements are. If you know, some of the famous research years ago was every web page should be less than 2 seconds or whatever it was. You can see that most major vendors don't live up to that. You know, Amazon's 5 seconds before you really see anything. It takes a while before all of these vendors are actually looking okay when you're on a slow device. So it helps you gauge where you are and that you have realistic goals. Another one is Google Crux. So there's another tool that I can come out and measure with. So if I come out to here, what Google has is in Chrome, everybody who has opted into telemetry, they're basically doing free rum for you using Chrome. So they're reporting back as they used your website, they're reporting back all of these metrics to Google. So I can come in here and punch in my domain name. And if your site is popular enough, it will basically score you and rank you and tell you how you're doing each month. So this is one of the metrics I also use within the business to say, look, outside group measuring us, this is what we see. And I've used this for, you know, quarter over quarter performance improvements. We made a big change. About a month later, it ends up showing up here just how they do their tracing. And I can use this to say, look, we got this much better. And then they show you how you rank. So it's just good things to know about where you're at. And then know when to quit, right? You could continue doing performance tweaks forever. My rule is if I'm going to do something, I want to see if it makes sense. I follow studies to see if other people see benefits, and then I test it myself. I'm going to try it, usually in an isolated environment, and make sure that whatever I'm going to get from a performance perspective is worth the amount of work I have to do. I'll talk about some things that I just chose never to do because yes, it made the site faster, but it also made it much harder for me to maintain. I have to do that benefit analysis of whether or not it's worth it. So through all that, we're going to start jumping into specific techniques. I've tried to rank these in the order of almost certainly you should do these things. Again, I won't say you always do this. Again, turn these things on, choose your metrics, run your tests, prove to yourself these things matter. But I do have them ranked in importance, and also a lot of these early ones are very easy to enable if you don't have it already. So the first one I'll talk about is HTTP compression. So the idea with compression is browsers know, just like if you've used pkzip, they know how to make your files smaller, and browsers that support it will send a header to the server, say they accept encoding. There's a couple different types of encoding, but basically that's telling the server, go ahead and make this file smaller before sending it to the client, and then the client will decompress it. So it makes the network transfer a lot faster. So our data center was in rural Minnesota, and we were running out of data many, many years ago. And so we decided to use compression. And the day we turned compression on, the next day we saved half of all of our bandwidth. So if you think about that, half of all the bandwidth we were using for our e-commerce site, we got back for free basically by turning this feature on. So we were doing it for bandwidth, but we also noticed the synthetic measurements I talked about were also 25% faster. So let's take a look at what that looks like. In the after version, when I show it to you in Fiddler here, we've got this bootstrap min.css. We'll take that example. If I come over to inspectors, it'll show me a little bar here that said that this is compressed. And you can see when it's compressed, it's about 36K. If I were to take off the compression, it's about 160K. So just by having compression enabled, I've cut that to maybe a fifth of the size it was before. So again, especially on slow connections, that's going to make a huge difference. Because all of us use different techniques, I'm not going to have time to go through exactly where you configure all of these with whatever system you might happen to use. So I'm more focused on what the technique is, and you can go find out how to enable this. Most web servers will have this turned on for static files, but if you pop into Fiddler, you can check and just make sure that those things are compressed. You should see it on CSS. You should use it on JavaScript files. Images will have a different type of compression. But just make sure that you're using those techniques. I also turn it on for all of our ASP.NET pages. So even though they're dynamic and each one of them is unique for our customer, it still saves us time to compress that and save that network time. So that is compression. The next thing I want to focus on is content expirations. So if you visited my website today, I run ASP.NET. You're going to come to my web server. I'm going to run the ASP.NET code. I'm going to give you HTML. You're going to see all the JavaScript, CSS images, fonts. You're going to have to download all that stuff if you haven't been here before. Once you do that, close your browser. If you were to come back and visit tomorrow, I want you to get my ASP.NET page because I want to rerun the database queries. Maybe something has changed. I have a sale going on today. Who knows? But ideally, if I haven't changed any of my CSS or JavaScript, I want to serve everything else from your browser cache. In other words, if you came yesterday and your browser cached all of that stuff on your device, I want to save your data and my server bandwidth and my server load. Why make you go get all of that stuff over again? So the idea with expirations, if you don't set expirations specifically, you're leaving it up to the browser to decide tomorrow when they return, they'll come and see, oh, logo.svg sitting right here in my cache. Is this thing fresh is the word they'd use? Not sure. The browser may go back to the server and say, I got this yesterday. Is this okay? So if you see a lot of 304 responses when you're doing Fiddler traces and such, that means the client went to the server just to ask if it was still fresh, and they got back the answer yes. Often that conversation is just as expensive as small files you would download. So again, the idea with content expirations, we just went through our site and said, JavaScript files, CSS, images, each folder we set an expiration for. So for instance, for images, I might say that I consider all of my images to be good for 30 days. So I'm going to set a content expiration policy. So if you look in the Fiddler trace here, there's a caching column. In the before version, there's no caching specified. If we look at the after version, this happens to be in seconds. I'm actually doing my CSS for a year, and I'm doing my images for 30 days, okay? So now if you were to come back, I'm specifically telling the browser, this is what I want you to do. If it's in their browser cache, use it. Please don't come back. So the trade-off is, what happens if I have to change one? Right? If it turns out I need to change one, all I need to do is change the URL that I'm using. So if I used to reference logo.svg, I could do, there's lots of different techniques depending on which one you prefer. I can do logo svg $v=2, for instance, or I could embed a version number in the actual file names. However you want to do that, but then you get the best of both worlds. If that file has been modified, it'll look in its browser cache and say, I don't see logo svg $v=2. It goes and gets a fresh copy. So that people who do have the caches, it'll be as fast as possible off their own machine. But if it turns out something has been changed, it will actually go back to the server and get it. And there's ways to automate that. We actually automate for our images. We actually append, people use hashes and other things. We append a number on the end of our images that recognizes the version of that image. So I don't have to make code changes to do it. In my case, it just automatically appends those and breaks the cache. Okay. Next one is content delivery network. So it's always interesting. The internet had been around for a long time, and two people were at a bar and they got in an argument about what matters more, bandwidth or latency. So they decided to do a study, and you can go out and follow the study here. But they wanted to know is, every ISP you go to, all they tell you is, here's our bandwidth, you're 100 megabits per second or whatever, and that's all they advertise. Latency is actually how long it takes to basically go over a network. And so if you go read this, basically ran once where they gave better bandwidth with each request. It starts out pretty good. We're going 1 megabit to 2 megabit to 3, you get a pretty good improvement, but at about 5 megabits per second or so, the average website, not talking Netflix and stuff here, our normal sites, it flattens out pretty fast. Having more bandwidth, it doesn't really help you. What actually helps you is having less latency. So in other words, if it takes you less time to talk to the server and get an answer, that you're going to win pretty linear with each improvement you can get from latency. So speed of light is speed of light. There's only so much you can do about latency. The idea with a content delivery network is I don't want you to come to my data center in Minnesota. What I want you to do instead is I want to have these servers spread out all over the US or the world, depending on your site, that are closer to your customers than my Minnesota data center is. So the idea is I use a CDN, and I'll show you, it makes a little more sense if I show you the code for it. If I were referencing a normal image from my own site, I would just do this. If I were, and I'm using example.com here, if I got a CDN, the CDN provider will typically give me a subdomain like cdn.example.com. So what happens is the browser will look this DNS name up. The trick is the CDN says, I'm going to find the closest CDN server to your location and give you back that IP address. So you're all in Salt Lake City or near there. If you hit the site for the first time, it'll find a CDN server. If you're the very first person to hit it, you probably won't have all this stuff cached. So the CDN will go to my web server, get it all, and it will then cache it locally. The rest of you then that hit the site, instead of having to go all the way back to get it, you'll serve it locally from the CDN. So it offloads, again, all of that bandwidth, all of my server load. But the important part from a performance is you're pulling files from a CDN that's much closer to you than having to come all the way back to my data center. So the good news is the code I have to do doesn't change much. Again, we've been doing this for years. We host all of our static files on a CDN. All of our images, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, all of that stuff gets pushed to the CDN. So you're really only coming back to my primary data center to run my ASP.NET page. Other than that, I want to serve as much as I can from the CDN. These have become so popular, it's easy to get a decent contract. I mean, the pricing has come down substantially. So again, it's usually a pretty easy win for people to be able to do this and offload your files closer to your customers.
So Robert, before you move on,
yeah,
one question that I have that others might have is, I mean, these CDNs are really pretty reliable. I mean, there's engineers much smarter than me that build these things out. But what do you do for fallback if, in the case of the file that you're looking for not being on the CDN or the CDN being down completely?
So I'm glad you asked. One of those historical things. We started bundling our JavaScript and CSS files, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I decided when we bundled them, I would start hosting them on the CDN. So I did that. About a week later, I had the only time I have had for my CDN an outage that was pretty major. And all of my pages on my site were blank because all my CSS wasn't there. So I learned that afternoon how to do fallbacks. I don't think, I gotta see if I put that in here. I didn't put it, yeah, I did right here. So in this case, and this is pretty specific, I'm pulling jQuery off a CDN, okay? I would really pull it from your own CDN, which is a whole nother discussion, but this is the magic code. If you get here and jQuery is not defined and this is a synchronous download, then it rewrites and writes a local tag to pull it off your own server. So you get the best of both again. If your CDN pulled the jQuery correctly, you're good. If it turns out that by the time you hear jQuery isn't there, then it will write a local link. And so in my actual production site, jQuery is kind of my bellwether. If jQuery is not defined by the time I get to that stage in the page, I assume that my CSS and my JavaScript did not come from the CDN properly. And I actually go pull and rewrite locally. So it'll pull it off my server. So it's going to be slower. It's going to have to come all the way to my data center and use my bandwidth, but at least it's not down. So I do that for all my CSS and JavaScript. I don't have fallbacks for all of my images personally. CDNs are pretty reliable. You would have to write stuff on the client to know that your image is successfully loaded from your CDN or not, and do something like this if they didn't. I have personally not gone that far, but it happens, right? I mean, nobody's perfect. You see outages with these things, and you still want to be able to deal with that, but that's one way that you can deal with that, if that makes sense.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. So I'll talk about bundling and minification. I put the bundling in italics for a reason, which we'll get to, but minification is a technique that removes white space, comments, semicolons. You've probably seen it before. I will just pull up a page here in case you haven't. So in the after version here, we'll look at Bootstrap min. You've probably seen this, right? In production, you want to serve minified files. And the reason you want to do that is they're going to be much smaller. So let's look at a before and after here. So if I look at JavaScript, if I just took Bootstrap itself, it's about 135K. If I take the after version, the minified, it's about 60K. So again, it's about half the size just by doing minification. So we always do all of our stuff minified. We actually did a build process. So if I were to go back here, when we were doing some performance work, we looked and we were using HTTP 1.1. And back then it was really important to make less total requests. So we took all of our JavaScript files and bundled them into a single JavaScript bundle, attached a version number to it, because we talked about caching. So you had to download that one bundle once. It was versioned. You'd keep it for a year. And the day we turned this on, basically our homepage was 46% faster. So it took about, I don't know, 6 hours of build time work. So when I build our production website, we run tasks to do minification. So I think today, grunt tasks, there's lots of different ways to do it that will run the minification, and then you get these kind of benefits. I put the bundling in italics just because we'll talk about HTTP2 and how that changes it slightly, but we minify all of our CSS, all of our JavaScript. You can do HTML. I don't. 2 reasons. I haven't found a good tool that does ASP.NET minification on the fly, and also some minification of HTML can change your layout. So I've heard of people that did minification and it made their layout slightly different, that I just decided I didn't want to do that. But again, minification is a pretty straightforward thing. If you need to troubleshoot when you're on the client, if you go into Dev Tools, you can actually use the pretty print feature that lets you unminify. Fiddler has an extension as well. If you're running Fiddler and turn the extension on, it will unminify all of the minified files so that you don't have to do that on the client. And then in production, I actually use source maps, which is a better answer. So when you create a minified file, you can create a map file so that if you open up DevTools on the client, that map file maps the minified back to the original source. So I can actually step through and troubleshoot using original source, but my customers all benefit from having minified files for production and for performance. And again, you can see it makes, for us, it made a huge difference. Talk about images next. Yep.
What was that about minification causing problems sometimes?
The only one that I've ever had a problem with is HTML. And like I said, I don't do it on HTML for 2 reasons. My HTML comes out of ASP.NET, so I would have to find a tool that on the fly would minify it before it's sent, and I just haven't found one. But I have heard people say that when they minified their HTML, sometimes the white space is important and change their layout. So you can certainly try it. I would just warn you that before and after, make sure that the minification tool you're using and the HTML you have doesn't change how your page lays out, because some of the time that spacing is important. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. So we'll talk about images. So I've been doing web development forever. And so before there was a thing called web fonts, designers wanted to have a certain font. And one of the ways to do it was they would actually create an image that had the text in the font they wanted. So we were basically using images to get text for the fonts we want, which hurts your SEO. it's bigger, it's more impacts your performance more than using web fonts. So if you've been using techniques like that, or we used to do gradients where you have the color slowly change, that wasn't possible before, so we had to use images. Those are things that CSS gives us now. So just make sure that what you're doing now actually needs to be an image. If it doesn't need to be an image and you can pull it off in CSS3, that's often a much better choice from a page weight perspective. The other thing is know the proper type to use. So if you're doing things like logos and other straight up sort of graphics, look at SVG. If you're doing photos, I recommend JPEGs. I'll talk about AVIF, WebP, JPEG XL are all in this kind of a category. Again, I get in arguments with people, so usually I say, if you don't believe me, try it for yourself, right? I always advise if you want to check it out and try it. But so I went to Australia. You can actually walk up to the top of this bridge, which is super cool. And here's a picture of people going up and down the bridge. This is the JPEG. People say, well, you can do PNGs for photos. You can. So if I open that guy up, that's what the PNG looks like. But if you look on disk here, the size difference, the JPEG is 58K and the PNG is 516K. And that's an optimized PNG. And the reason is, I'll get into it with JPEGs, I can optimize JPEGs further for photos than I can with PNGs. And again, if you don't believe it, do a couple versions and see for yourself. But just make sure you're picking the right type. I often see one of the biggest problems I see, people use a PNG for a photo and they end up, I was helping a conference site where their homepage was slow and they basically had a really large image. It was 1.8 meg as a PNG and I got an optimized JPEG that looked equivalent for about 200K. So just make sure you're using the right type for the right thing. That's a very common mistake.
So what do you think about the Google new WebP format?
So I didn't list WebP here, and I'll show you because I'm going to talk about responsive images here in a minute. So if you haven't seen Can I Use before, Can I Use tells you how well features are supported. So AVIF is an even newer format that's coming out that's got some really good reviews as a JPEG replacement. This is WebP. WebP now has finally got to the point where it's got pretty good browser support. I used to still have to support IE11. Thankfully, I don't now. But you can also see Safari is not supporting WebP yet. So by not having that support, I'm going to have to do some sort of polyfill. So it's true that WebP typically is 10 to 20% smaller size, but I now have to use a completely different technique to serve it and do polyfills that, for me personally, when I talked earlier about trade-offs, not worth it for me. I'm already making our imaging staff do some other things I'm going to show you here that I don't feel it's worth it for our site. A lot of sites do it. So if you've got a good image process and you can spit out both versions and you want to do the polyfill stuff I'll talk about, go for it. WebP is pretty solid. And as I said, AVIF is coming in the future, and then JPEG XL I didn't even list because unfortunately the testing on it has been super for photos, but nobody supports it yet in a live browser. So you just kind of keep an eye on when these things make sense.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So responsive images were the other big win. So we changed our e-commerce site to be responsive years ago, and responsive, if you haven't done it, just means it will look different at different breakpoints. So a small breakpoint for typical phones, tablets, desktops. When we did it and responsive design came out, it was pretty exciting. People did responsive sites, but the knock was responsive sites were slow. And the reason that they said that is because we just had one image tag. It was image source equals whatever. Okay, well, I need an image that might be shown on a really, high pixel density desktop, or it might be on a phone. Well, I need to pick an image that's the best quality that I have because I can only use one of them. And so that was kind of the state of the art. Well, came together, the community actually came together and said, we need something better. And they came up with, and I'll show you, there's two different variants of this. The variant that we use is called source set. So for responsive images, instead of being a single image with a source, ignore this for a moment, you can create the image at various widths. And by using source set, you're telling the browser, here are all the images I have, here are all the widths. You know what the browser's like. You know how big this has to be, you know the pixel density, you know, you can look at the network connection. You pick the best one. So when I first saw this, I kind of freaked out because I'm a control person. I'm like, I don't want the browser picking, you know, is it going to make the right choice? But I'll show you what the size difference is. If you look, the 128 width is only 2K. The full one for the desktop is almost 200K. So you're looking at 100 times larger image by not using responsive image techniques. By doing this, and I actually just embed the width right in the name. And I do that because I can look at my web server logs then and immediately see what are the most popular widths actually being used. Talking about, we use Photoshop. We get a good crop of the bridge walk, and then we have automated tools. You can do it in PaintShop Pro and other editing tools, but you basically say, spit out these 5 sizes for me. And again, the reason you care is because that's a huge difference. If you're on a phone, you're downloading, you know, 1/100th the size that you would have had to download otherwise if it figures out you only need to show a really small image. So this is the difference. It's a little more markup for me. When you were asking about WebP, WebP would use the alternative technique, which is called the picture. So there's actually an element called picture, and you'd say, here are the different sizes, but you'd also say, if you support WebP, here are the WebP ones. If you do JPEG, here's the JPEG ones. So your markup gets kind of doublish this. It's more markup to support that. And you have to create all those sizes for 2 different formats. So for me personally, I just haven't done it. There's a lot of people who have. So if that works for you, I think WebP is a good choice. It's more important to me, make sure you're using source set and picture and responsive techniques, and you're using proper types, not missing and using a photo for logos and things like that. Then you're going to be good. I'll mention, go ahead. Yeah.
Does this source set update as you like scale your browser window?
Yeah, so if you were to switch, and I'll show it on mine here, it'll figure out, the browser will, when it needs to make an adjustment. So as I do, let me make this smaller. Actually, I'll just do it in DevTools. If you haven't seen this, you can go to here and say that you want this to be responsive, and you can just tweak the size. That doesn't demo as well as I wanted it to. Sorry, I'll do it the other way. It'll go re-get other sizes. And browsers are all different. If they think that and I cannot get this, I'm sorry, with the way my screen is here, I can't quite grab with everything running. Try it one more time. The gist is yes. I mean, modern browsers are smart enough that if I started on mobile and I went up, and you do a Fiddler trace, you'll see that as you hit that next breakpoint and it thinks it needs a higher quality image, it'll end up downloading that second one again, right? Is that what you were asking?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, yep. I'm going to mention client hits is another alternative that's been in the works for a while, but the concept is the client will tell the server, here's my pixel density, I support these image types. So instead of having to do source set and picture sort of things, you can do server-side code to figure out the best image to send. It's still a little early in my book, so I just want you to know it's there. I want to focus on the JPEG part I was talking about. So the JPEG, I can do compression. And I always freak out designers when I tell them this, but you say you can trade off size versus quality. And you can often cut the size by 50%. And the key part they miss is without a visual impact. So I'll show you. We get in arguments and they say, I don't want to do that. So I always do this. I take an image and I say, I'll compress it at various levels. One of these is your original. The other one is one that I want to use. And if you can find for me, pick out the best one here, or which ones you find acceptable. And if yours happens to be the only acceptable one, we'll use yours. Otherwise, we'll use one of the ones I optimized. So I throw in a couple freebies for them, right? These look horrible. just so they can see that I'm doing various compression. If you look at the rest, even stacked side by side, it's pretty hard to tell that I've tweaked one and gotten better sizes. Turns out this is the original 172K. The one below it here is 32K. So again, about a fifth the size. And even stacked next to each other, you know, I'm not a photographic site. If I were a photographer and I'm selling, you know, major artwork and the quality of this image is the entire sale, might be a different discussion. Most sites here, it's not worth it, right? I don't need an image 5 times the size. When we looked at the earlier Fiddler traces, most of the savings I got was by doing compression like this. So modern tools, I use PaintShop Pro myself for personal. You can pull up your original and your other image, and it just has a slider. So you can literally just move the slider to the point where you see the quality start to degrade enough and then back off a little bit and see the size difference. And we've actually built this into our Photoshop scripting. We just picked a decent compression level. So every time we take our images, it spits out the 5 sizes I talked about. It also auto compresses to something that's safe. I could probably manually tweak it a little better, but I want tools to be able to do this because I need to be able to do that at scale, if that makes sense. But that's the trade-off stuff. And again, you just pick that right measurement. And this is where you can often get really simple wins, especially on, you know, like I said, you go to somebody's homepage. Lots of people are going to download this image. It's worth the 5 or 10 minutes for me to go in there manually, and I'll often be able to cut straight up JPEG images by 50% or more and keep the visual quality the same. Next thing is progressive JPEGs. So I've been doing web forever. Progressive was a cool thing before. There's 2 actual different types of JPEGs for how they paint. So I'm going to go into Fiddler again here. I'm going to make my browser act like it's on a modem. And I hopefully will not forget to change that back. Watch how these 2 images paint. So the image on the left looks done already. That's a progressive JPEG. So what it does is it changes how it gets painted, where it paints the basic structure first, a little blurry, and then it improves the quality. Normal JPEGs on the right. So most JPEGs on the internet, when people went and looked, about 90+% are what are called baseline JPEGs. That's what you have on the right. In your tool, you can just say, I want to save it as progressive. Generally, they end up being the same physical size. So it's not a size penalty to do progressive. But if your people are on a slow connection, the perceived performance benefit, the left side looks done. And yet the right side gives you the impression that the site is pitifully slow. So that's something you might want to look at. Turn that back off. The last thing with this is if you take pictures, you know that your camera puts a lot of metadata into files. Fiddler has an extension you can download called show image bloat. I'm going to go pull up the page here and hit Control F5. And you notice on the left-hand side, it says 15% of this image is actually metadata. So if I were to go look at what that means, so like I said, every time you're taking pictures with your camera, if I go look at the details, it's going to have shutter speed and all that stuff. Now, here's the camera I use. That's interesting to a photographer. That's not anything that my customers are going to see. It's not a visual thing. So I can remove that metadata. So if you look, this one was 46, about 47K. I use a tool called JPEG Tran, and that takes that metadata out. So you can see that's now all gone, and that saved me 15%, and this has no visual impact whatsoever. So as long as you own the image, if you bought the image, copyright is part of the metadata, so you just have to check if legally you can remove that. We just run this JPEG Tran tool against all of our images because I don't need to slow you up by 15%, right? It's a simple way to gain some performance by having the file be smaller. The other thing for images, so we're a food site. Years ago, we had, you come to our ice cream category. we used to do what search engines do, where you had the paging. So you'd see the first 15 products, you'd hit the next page. Our designers and SEO people said they really wanted it to be all on one page. And I said, that's great. But now I have maybe 90 pictures on a page that most people will never see. I don't want people to wait to download all of those and impact the above the fold paint. So we used a technique called lazy loading. We still use this plugin. I'll tell you, there's native support now that's come out. You can go look at, can I use? It's not everywhere I want to be right now. So I don't feel like dealing with polyfills and everything. So I still use this. It works really well. What this technique does is, I'll go back to this example. This was the little wizard behind the curtain before. Instead of saying source set, you say data-source set. Data- attributes are ignored by browsers. They're meant to be used for JavaScript. So I just have to add a class that says lazy load, make it data source set, and include that JavaScript here at the end. And what that does is, when you first come to the page, and I don't have time here to show you in Fiddler, you can try this in Fiddler. When you first paint the page, use this one. These images are all downloaded, but I'm guessing all of these three for major, most people's resolutions, these will not be above the fold. So I set those properties I talked about. So those do not get downloaded unless you scroll. So the way the plugin works is, as I'm scrolling down, maybe right about here, it says, oh, there's an image here that's lazy loaded. It goes and takes that data dash off for you. And then the browser kicks in and says, oh, I got to do my source set stuff. Cool. What's the right size? And it goes and downloads it. And we've used this for a long time on our production site. If you're on a super slow connection and you scroll really fast, you might see placeholders for an instant where those images aren't, and life is trade-offs, right? I want the main page to paint faster. Most of my customers are really satisfied because they're not waiting for all these images. And then as they're normally scrolling, they're coming in right in sync and they don't even know that I've done lazy loading. So test it out for yourself, see if it makes sense. It's made a huge improvement for us on images we don't need to download if people don't scroll. Okay. Similar to this, I was talking about the third-party thing that actually kind of ruined my first demo there. I'm concerned about using third-party resources on my site, because if I ever pull things from another vendor, analytics, any of those kind of tools that I'm pulling from someone else, I'm now dependent on someone else's server for my experience. This is something I actually had to write myself, so fair warning, but it's a technique that I set up, and it'll be easier to show you here. So what I said is, if you have a script, and here's a good example, I've got this third-party JavaScript. It doesn't affect how my page is painted. It's just something like analytics or something I want to eventually have happen, but I don't want it to impact my major experience. Instead of using source, I just made up this data-deferred. And then when I have my onload fire, so your onload fires for your body when your primary resources are loaded, this calls this method. This is very similar to what the other plugin does. It just says, hey, go look for every data deferred source and change it to a source, and every data deferred source set to a source set. So then what happens is all the major stuff paints like you would expect. The onload eventually fires when all of my critical resources are done, and then it kicks in, changes these to be what they were, and then all of my third parties happen. And what you saw in the demo I didn't intend earlier was I was testing my site the other day, and I wanted to prove that one of my pages was slow because of third-party impact. So I basically said in Fiddler script, I said, make my domain be normal, but if it's not my domain, slow it down, slow that resource request by 25 seconds. That's a good way for me to test and see that this technique is working right or not. So I try to defer all the third parties I can on our site using this technique. But if it turns out somebody didn't use this technique, I can quickly tell if it's impacting my page paint. So we try to defer as much as we possibly can. And like I said, this is just something I had to write myself. There are ways to do this now in JavaScript. There's 2 of them. So I'm going to show you how this works with async or defer. So first I'm going to go into Fiddler. Clear this. So Fiddler has what's called an auto responder. And I can make things be intentionally slow. So I've got these 3 JavaScript files, alert 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to make 1 take 4 seconds, 2 take 2 seconds, and 3 take 3 seconds. If I go back to my page, first I'll just show you if you do naive includes of JavaScript, script tags block. So what'll happen is the browser will sit here until it gets completely downloaded and executed before it will start to move on to the next. That's just how it works. So if you were to run, because I made autoresponder make it intentionally slow, if I were to go run this, you'll see my customer is seeing nothing. They see a blank page. Now the 1 finishes, 2 finishes, 3 finishes. Now they see content. That's a poor experience. I would love to use the technique I showed you just beforehand, but there are some that don't work that way. And if you want to use something built into a browser, if I were to say async, and I'm going to save that and go request this again, what I'm telling the browser is these things do not matter for the paint. So go ahead and download them in the background. And async says run them in whatever order they get done. So the important thing is you saw content right away. So it's no longer blocking my content. My page will paint faster. 2 happen to finish first. So that goes, then 3, and then 1, which is fine if I don't care about the order. If I do care about the order, I typically will use defer. So best choice, use the technique I showed before. If you can't, for some reason, use defer. What defer does is it moves it further down in the page life cycle, not as far as the one I wrote did, but further than async, and it keeps them in the same order. So if your JavaScript is dependent on each other, so let's go kick this off again. You'll see I see content right away, and then I'll see 1, 2, 3. So it executes them in source order. So again, it's just a technique. If these scripts aren't needed for your paint, put a defer on them so that they don't block when your stuff gets painted. Some other cool things that have been added to the browsers are resource hints. So this is easier to show you. So let's say I've got this JavaScript file down here I'm going to download. I can use these new hints. So I could put a meta tag that says DNS prefetch. So basically I'm telling the browser, as soon as you get here, I eventually need you to go connect to this other ajaxmicrosoft.com third-party site. So start doing the DNS resolution now. It takes a while to look up DNS names. Please start that now. So that was cool when it came out. I would instead today say pre-connect. And what pre-connect says is if you know the handshake TCP has to set up, you should be using HTTPS, so TLS has to set up. Pre-connect says, I know you eventually have to just go get all that connection stuff done. Get the encryption set up. So by the time the browser actually gets down to my script tag here, hopefully it might even already be done. So there have been sites and studies that show for some people that makes a vast improvement. I've turned that on mine, and I'm going to tell you, I left them in here for the demo. Besides doing it as a meta tag, you can actually do it as a response header in your web server. That's better. So if you're going to do this in production, you can set up a pre-connect that says, so for my example, you come to my e-commerce site, I could put a pre-connect response header that says, go to my cdn.example.com we talked about before. It'll start getting that connection for me before it even starts parsing the HTML because it sees it in the response header from the server. I've tested it. For us, it's not been as huge of an improvement as others. And so I have yet to do this, but I'm close to doing this. I kind of I test things, I rank them. This will be a benefit to me. I just had some other benefits that were easier. So I kind of went after those. But these resource hints are cool things built into browsers to make that stuff better for loading. Couple important things, focus on your critical rendering path. So one of the things I've been looking at that a lot of people have been talking about is inlining critical CSS. So if you have a really big CSS file, it might pay for you to split out the stuff that's really important for, if we were to look back at our page here, maybe this part right here, I could actually take the CSS, and there's tools to do this, figure out which part of the big CSS file is needed just to paint this, put that CSS directly into your HTML. That way, as soon as the browser gets the HTML back, it doesn't have to wait to go pull the CSS. It can literally start applying those styles right away. And again, some people have seen some really good benefits for that. I have yet to find good tooling to make that easy for us. And to split up my CSS has not been fun, so I haven't done it yet. But it's something you may want to keep your eyes on. I want to mention that URLs are case sensitive, if you didn't know that, from a browser perspective. So if you look, I've got 3 images that are just referenced slightly differently with how they're cased. And if we go do a Fiddler trace of what happens when I request that page, I'm basically linking to the same image 3 times. And if I go to pull it up in any of the modern browsers, I see I still have my image bloat on. I'm gonna have to turn that off, sorry. That won't be very visible. I'll do that again. Even though it's the exact same image, it got downloaded 3 times. So what does that tell you? The casing you use for your resources matters. Are your developers likely to do this? No, but what they are likely to do, I like this sort of casing, the camel casing, capitals at the beginnings. Some other people like lowercase. So if I code my page referencing all of our images using camel casing and you do all of yours lowercase, come to my page, I get you all the images, we turned on caching, yay, we optimized our images, they're all sitting in your browser cache. You go to the other developer's page that they were working on, and they're not the same. From a browser's perspective, it says, I don't have a flag bridge, so it goes all the way back to the server and just ruins all the optimizations that I just did to save it in the browser cache. So we just made the rule all lowercase. It's just easier to do it that way. And by following that rule, then I can assure that across the site with different developers, we're consistently referencing things so that we're taking advantage of our caching. I'll mention font subsetting. So sometimes you get a font file. So we had a font given to us to put on our website that actually had non-English characters in it. So the font, they told me, they said, here, put this font on our thing. And I'm like, that's a 2 meg font. That's huge. And so I went in, I think it was Font Squirrel, and said, take out all the characters but the English characters, because we're just an English site. And we got down to like 28K. So from 2 meg to 28K. So just pay attention to things like that in fonts. There are ways to take languages you don't support and stuff out so that you're not downloading huge fonts. I want to mention TLS 1.3. It's really a security thing. It's the most recent transport level security that's used by HTTPS. So we turned it on from a security perspective, but if you know how the handshake works, TCP and then TLS, it's multiple times back and forth, and we were talking about latency. TLS 1.3 shortcuts the HTTPS connection establishment. It does 1 less round trip. And so basically I turned it on. It was a configuration for our CDN. I just said, make us support 1.3. And the next day we were 20% faster on our measurements, because all of our clients had 1 less back and forth they had to do for every resource connection that they needed to set up with our CDN. And then we brought it back to our data center. So not only is it better for security, it's a simple thing to turn on, and then you could see a performance boost like that. Talk about HTTP 2 quick. I could go on for this for a long time, but HTTP 2, the main improvement from a performance perspective was, instead of doing what HTTP 1.1 did, 1.1 would only let you get 1 resource on a connection. So when I showed you before, if we go back to our web page test, if we look at our waterfall, I needed to get all of these images. They're all from the same domain, but HTTP 1.1 said I will open up 6 separate connections because I can only get one thing on a connection at a time. And so the browsers just decided they were supposed to do 2. Each one of them started to cheat. Most of them did 6, but establishing a new connection takes time. You need to start that handshake and everything. So HTTP 2 doesn't require that. It just uses one connection to get all of your resources. So I want to show you the difference. I kind of like this demo. I kind of hate this demo. So I'll show it to you and then we'll explain it. So here is HTTP. So this is HTTP 1.1. Took about 3.4 seconds using HTTPS, which is going to strike you at first. You're going to say, wait a minute, the encrypted version is 83% faster than the non-encrypted. What's going on there? Well, you need to have HTTPS in order to use HTTP 2. Once you use HTTP 2, it doesn't have to do 6 of these images at a time like it did here. It can start doing them all in parallel, basically as fast as your connection's going to allow. So that's true. That's cool. That's the biggest benefit of HTTP 2. You don't have to create all those connections. Realistically, I don't have a web page that has 360 little check marks on it. So it's a little skewed. In real life, I didn't get an 83% improvement for our site, but we did get a boost by turning on HTTP 2 just because it manages connections so much better than it did before. If you do use HTTP 2, I used to teach a lot of performance techniques that I would at least question and test now. So the first one I mentioned before, we literally bundled every JavaScript file we had into a single file in HTTP 1.1 because we were intentionally trying to reduce connections. Now that the connection penalty is lower in HTTP 2, we don't want to probably bundle them all together. So there's been a lot of research, a lot of debates. If you look into this, most people aren't saying go from one file back to 40 JavaScript files. There's some benefit to keeping smaller bundles. So you can look into that, test for yourself. But the point is, don't jam them all into a single file. If you're using HTTP 2, you won't see the benefits that you originally did. Same thing with some of these other techniques, if you've done them. So you notice when I had cdn.example.com, people would cheat. They would create a cdn2 and a cdn3.example.com because you get 6 connections per host. They'd basically get 18 downloads at a time. So people did this for performance. Now with HTTP 2, again, it's questionable if that's going to really save you versus some of the work that you have to do that. And I'll skip some of the rest of that. I want to mention a couple tools quickly. The first one is Google Page Speed. So you can actually come out and punch in your website again, and it will do 2 things. It will evaluate your page, and it will also give you some of that free RUM data that we looked at before. So I'm going to show you a different view of this. Page Insights uses Lighthouse, which is built into DevTools. So let me pull up DevTools here. All right, let's go to performance before. So what Lighthouse is it's a bunch of audits built into DevTools that will do so I'm going to do a mobile performance analysis. I'll kick this off. It's going to score me, but the cool thing is it also gives me a bunch of hints about what I could improve. So if you're new to performance and you want to get some good recommendations, a lot of the things we've already talked about in this talk. Okay, so I scored a 60. And it breaks down for me why I scored a 60. But like I said, it's cool if you come down here, it says, hey, you have images that are too big. Yeah, we knew that. You should use HTTP 2. Knew that. Do your JavaScript better. So you can look through these, minify. If you don't understand what these things are, what's cool is it's got a link here to learn more. So you can go out and say, what is HTTP 2? What are they talking about? Why would it matter? So that's kind of cool. I'm going to go pull up my after version here. Clear this and hope that everything is right here again. Let's see how much better it is. So with all the techniques that I used, it's only a 98. It was 100 last time. I'm sad. Again, it'll give me some hints on some other things that I could do. I'm using Bootstrap, and so there is some CSS in there that I don't happen to use on this page. So there are techniques to be able to pull that stuff out. But again, you can use this. I use this internally to communicate with our groups to say, look, you used to score 60, we did this thing, now we're at a 98. Page Insights is this same tool, but also RUM-based data. So it'll not only tell me this, but it'll also tell me everybody who used Chrome on my website, all that data that was collected, they'll also overlay that and help score my site using that, which is cool. We already saw Fiddler. Making stuff intentionally slow is a critical thing to make sure that when you could test your site and see, what if my CSS was slow? What happens to my page performance? How does it paint? And make decisions about the inlining and stuff we talked about. So I'm a Pluralsight author. I do have a course on web performance. It shows you how to do the image compression. It shows you how to set it as progressive, all those kind of things. A full one on images as well. So how do you do responsive images, the source set, the picture, all that kind of stuff. I have 2 of them on Fiddler to show you how, and in the debugging one, I specifically say you have this problem. Which one of these 2 is the right tool? And it shows how to diagnose some performance problems and such. So that's my Twitter, that's my email blog. That is the link to the slides and the code. Again, I have both the before and after version of the site. But that is all I had, unless people had any specific questions they wanted to go through.
Excellent, thank you.
Welcome.
I do want to pass on a comment about, let's see, comment on the YouTube was shared. I like the deferred third-party trick by renaming DOM elements. I never thought of doing that. So that comment was shared on YouTube.
Okay.
And I just want to say, I thought this presentation was excellent. There were so many things that I hadn't thought about. I'd jump into web development and then out of web development back into desktop development and back and forth, and things move so fast on the website that there's a bunch of things that you showed that I didn't know. So
well, good.
Thank you so much.
I live in the web and it changes that fast, and I feel the same way. So
Yeah.
I'm constantly finding out something new, and they're innovating all the time. So it's a good space to be in, but I'm glad that you found useful things.
Yeah. RJ shared a link. The Pluralsight's free this week. So if you want to check out a couple of Robert's courses and you don't have a Pluralsight license normally, you can view courses for free for I think until Sunday.
That sounds right.
Does
And we'll
anybody else
mention
have
one
any
other
questions
thing
or
while we
comments?
wait for questions too. So tomorrow at 3 p.m. Central, I also do I'm involved a lot with that.us. So just literally that.us is an online community. One of the things I do for performance is I offer to do free performance reviews of your website. So if you want to show up tomorrow, bring your URL, and I will sit with you and go through the tools and basically troubleshoot your site and tell you, these are the 5 things that I think you should work on. I try to do that every month on that.us, and tomorrow happens to be the day that I'm doing it. So again, 3 p.m. Central, that.us, if you're interested, just show up with your URL and we'll pull up these tools and see if we can find things for your specific site that we could improve if you're interested in that as well.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
I just want to say I learned a whole lot and I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, so normally we would clap, but I think we can clap with reactions if you want. I think that's appropriate. Lots of those things.
I have too many windows open. I can't find my reactions, so I can just.
It's always a challenge, right?
Yep.
Just another quick question.
Yeah.
Do you guys use any specific type of database to be able to scale, or is scaling a big issue in regards to database for your company?
It certainly is. I have very aggressively cache is where we got most of our wins. So for instance, we've been doing this forever. When we were classic ASP and you came to one of our category pages, we had to hit the database to get all the products in the category and then hit again to get all the product data. We started using ASP.NET caching instead. So once a day, I get all of the categories and products. And the next day, half of all of our SQL Server queries went away. So I very aggressively cache in web server memory, but we don't have any, typical SQL Server sort of backend behind an API. But I would say the caching at both a global level for everybody and also at a session level for you as a particular customer is where I get most of my server side. But again, typically for us, we're not bound by the backend time. Soder's book was interesting because it said, let's say it takes a half a second to get the page, and then to paint it is 4 seconds. Even if I made the backend code twice as fast, I've only saved 20 or 250 milliseconds, whereas opposed to the changes I can make on the front end can cut off seconds. So unless you're specifically bound, these will have more impact, if that makes sense.
And you're using SQL Server?
Yeah.
I'm making a social network and it has a lot of content.
Okay.
Queries that merge a lot of content.
Yep.
And I'm just to the point where I'm deploying here soon, at least for a beta version. And I'm concerned about the queries taking a long time.
Yep.
And somebody told me that I might need to go to NoSQL of some sort because those scale better. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I don't get quite as involved in the back end stuff. But yeah, I know people are saying document databases, and it depends on if you're doing the queries on your own or relying on like Hibernate or that sort of level in between. But like I said, luckily I don't do back end. Someone else does that and they write good queries. I cache as much as I can on the front end, and most of our perf things are all of this front end stuff is way more impactful. Someone will put a huge image on your homepage that will make your query look small, typically. You know what I mean? But that's what the measurement tools will tell you. If your first time the first byte is long, then you need to put some focus there. Most sites that won't be the case, and you'll have easier wins to do here than there. But
okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks. Good.
Yeah.
Last call for questions or comments. Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert. I'm going to take
You're welcome.
control of the screen back.
Okay.
Well, there we go. And let me share my screen for a minute, and we'll. There we go. So I've pasted the link into the chat for feedback for Robert and for prize entry. So be sure you go out there and fill out the feedback, and that will be how you get entered into our drawing for prizes here in a few minutes. On that feedback form is a question about whether you would be willing to or interested in doing lightning talks in future meetings. If you say yes or maybe, then we will email you a few days before the meeting and give you just a little reminder, so that way when it's time, when we ask for lightning talks, you're not hit cold, and you can have a little bit of time to prep what you might want us to talk about. I'm also going to paste another link into the chat here. We are soliciting proposals for speakers on topics for the next year. We have a speaker lined up for November we'll talk about here in a minute, but we have slots for most of next year. And so if you would like to be a presenter, like to be a speaker here for our user group, or if you know someone who would, you can share this in your network. We're happy to take any proposal for anything .NET related or .NET adjacent, and we'd love to have you continue or even begin your speaking career with our user group. So make sure you bookmark that link. We also want to invite you to join our Slack channel where we have we post job opportunities, have lots of discussion. All of those links can be found at slcnet.tech. We also want to thank our sponsors, Health Equity, Tech Systems, JetBrains, DealerTrack, O'Reilly, and Manning. These sponsors are what makes hosting these meetings and giving out prizes possible for us. So thank you very much to the sponsors. We do want to let you know that, see if I've got the link here. I will paste a link for Manning. Manning is offering a free book essentially to everybody. We've posted this in a previous meeting, but this is the link to the Manning site. And if on the Manning site, you search for this title, Object Storage Across the Cloud, you can get that book downloaded for free. And then we also have, you can also use a discount code for anything that's not already discounted. Anything that's not already discounted 35%, you can use this discount code that's posted into the chat for 35% off books or ebooks at Manning. And with that, I think none is probably monitoring the feedback, so we can, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute here, and none, you can take over and start sharing when you're ready to do the prizes. I would suggest though that Robert probably didn't do feedback for himself, but we could probably add Robert's name into the names of people who are eligible for prizes, I would think.
I can do that.
Self-feedback is hard.
Yeah.
Like,
It is.
I bet everybody else's feedback for Robert is probably better than the feedback he would give himself. But you know what? I think it was a fantastic presentation.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
It
very
really
good.
was. Yeah. Awesome. Let me share this. I want to share sound too so you guys can hear the clickies. Cool. You guys see that okay? Cool. All right. So first prize is